made reference to privatization. Wichita once had a privately owned and run transportation. It's my understanding that one of the major reasons why we went to the system we have now, city ownership, was that there were all kinds of federal grants made to cities but would not be made to private organization. And yet you mentioned several cities have largely privatized. How have they gotten around that disadvantage of not getting a subsidy?
It's two different meanings of the term. I mean, back in the 50s when the Fed started providing those incentives, they were private companies that owned and operated systems. Rail, buses, that sort of thing. What we're talking about now is contracting. So the government still owns it. They own they own the fleet, they own I mean, it depends on where you are, but they're going to own the operation. It's their operation. They're having someone else come in and they're outsourcing the management or operations. That's a different situation. There's also local regulations that basically prevent a lot of other types of transit opportunities from being delivered. Things like jitneys and that sort of service. In a lot of places, it's basically prohibited to have a competitor to your transit system. So the public policy has moved over the last half century in the direction of forcing transit monopoly into the public sector. Where the public sector is finding the partnerships with the private sector is just through contracting, basically. Bringing dollars to the table, or operational maintenance, contracting expertise, that sort of thing. Still fundamentally owned and operated by the public sector. Does that answer your question?
Right, and you mentioned jitney, and I've heard of it often, but really, how is it defined and how does it work, jitney service?
Wendell's seen this stuff around the world. He's probably a better person to ask.
Like a trolley or something?
I mean, there's all kinds of different services. There's, Wendell, let me just throw that one to you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, jitneys came in the, and I'm not old enough to remember this, between 1910 and 1920. Competing against streetcars, the transit industry worked very hard to make them virtually illegal almost everywhere. There is a jitney service along Atlantic Avenue. I think it is I think it's Atlantic Avenue in Atlantic City. Works very well, last I heard, but the great advantage of Atlantic City is it's a 3-block wide city with one street. It's a nice private way of doing things, but it's largely illegal in this country and works very well. We don't call them jitneys. It works very well, for example, in Manila, where you have old Jeeps converted from World War II Jeeps that provide service and make it possible for poor people to get throughout the entire urban area far faster than any other way besides cars, and the entire public planning operation of the world considers it to be the worst served transit city in the world, when in fact it probably is the best.
Thank you.
And beyond that, there's also, sort of extend beyond just transit, and you look at things like taxi cabs. Taxi cabs are one of the most absurdly regulated industries in this country. And you really start to see that when Uber and Lyft start coming into a community. Who freaks out?
Right.
It's the taxi cab owners, or those companies come in, because they're already in this crazily regulated system, but they've come to live with it. And then now you've got a competition that's coming from the technology sector, which is a little different. And the people who are living under an absurd system then feel threatened, and it's all crazy. I think we just need a lot of deregulation on that side too.
I think I heard you mention that in Denver that some private companies made some capital investment in the light rail or something like that. Could you clarify for that? But importantly, what incentive do they have for doing that? Why would a private company invest in infrastructure like that? What's the economics of the transaction and so forth?
Private companies there's probably about $400 billion of global capital around the world that is looking for public sector infrastructure to invest in. It's coming highways, toll roads, transit, water, wastewater, social infrastructure like public buildings, courthouses, that sort of thing. There's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, return on investment is the big thing. Governments tend to not have a lot of upfront capital to deploy to build lots of things. We could go each sector by sector of why that is. And each sector has its own situation. And you have declining federal money that's coming into a lot of communities to put into infrastructure. It's leading to a situation where a community that maybe doesn't want to take on new bonded debt, traditional bonded debt, or doesn't have just buckets of cash sitting there to put into a water system or something like that, are starting to look at, well, is there something we can get from the private sector? Typically, you're going to be seeing cost savings. Because the way these things are structured, you're looking at anywhere from a 20 to 50 to 99-year deal in a concession lease, commercial lease type agreement. And over the life of that, you're going to see cost savings through life cycle approaches to maintenance and operations. That's what you might see a little bit more money on the front end because the private sector is going to get, the cost of capital is a little bit more on the private side for a big infrastructure investment than the public sector, which in the US is typically tax-exempt financing. But where the differential really happens is on the next 50 years of that asset. And the private sector, if they're coming in and putting down capital and saying, we're going to build this, I'll just make up something, water plant. It might cost us a little bit more than it would cost you as a government just to go out and just bond for this and do it yourselves. But what we can guarantee you is that we can keep those life cycle costs down over the next 50 years. And so that tends to be about 2/3 of that total cost if you kind of cycle it out over its life. And so the private guys, they're looking for a profit. They're not getting into this for altruistic reasons. But what happens is you build these contracts such that you've put the risk of that profit, that's on the private sector. You don't guarantee them a profit. We just saw this in Indiana where they did a long-term lease of the Indiana toll road. The investors came in 2006, gave Indiana $4 billion and said, we want to run your road for you for the next 75 years. And the private guys basically estimated high. They thought traffic and revenue was going to be much higher than it was. They overbid on it. The recession hit. Traffic took a hit. They're going to lose their shirts. The state didn't. They keep that money. They've put it into new infrastructure. They got $4 billion for roads they didn't have before. They don't have to give it back. And they're going to have someone else come in and refinance that road and keep it up to the specifications that are in a contract, in a long-term contract. And so that's the way these things tend to work. On the transit side, transit's always subsidized. I think there's like 2 places in the world. Wendell would probably know this. I'm only aware of 2 in the world. They're like in Japan or Taiwan or something.
Japan and Hong Kong.
Hong Kong, okay. The transit actually pays for itself. So transit is always going to be subsidized, but what you're really doing there through a public-private partnership thing is minimizing the subsidy.
So let's say, if I could follow up on a water project, because that's one of the largest component of the proposed sales tax. If there was private ownership of the water project, we're not talking about that company then sending water bills to all the 150,000 customers in the city. Instead, that company would have just one customer, the city of Wichita, that buys that water or some other arrangement from them. Is that kind of something how it would work?
Well, actually, in water and wastewater, it could work either way. You have part of the private water market is sort of, they own it, they operate it, and they sell water to customers and they send them bills. The other segment of that private sort of water market is doing contract relations like I'm talking about with these other things, where the city says, look, we don't want to take on all the risk and the capital costs of all this stuff. Just do it for us. Have our name on it. It says City of Wichita or City of Phoenix. We need a new water plant. We don't want to do it ourselves for various reasons. We want you to do it. Build it, finance it, operate it. It's just going to have our logo on it. We're going to technically own it, but you're going to run and finance it and build it. So you can do it either way.
Now, I think there are some people in this city that would say, well, these businesses, they want to make a profit, therefore they have to charge much more than the city would charge itself.
That is a more complicated issue. I'll just try to summarize it down to this. One of the things that we see in the public sector is there's always a political pressure to keep rates low for people. Okay, so if we're talking about water systems, for instance, the political pressure is always going to be don't raise the rates, don't raise the rates. What that does is it leads to the same cycle that you see with the roads. It leads to we're not getting enough in to actually put the capital investment back into the system to keep it properly maintained, yada, yada, yada. And then at some point in the future, it's going to cost us way more to do these repairs because we've been skimping on it the whole time because we're afraid to charge people, have inflation-adjusted water rates or something like that. People get used to a water rate and they don't want to ever see it change and they'll freak out. So what you tend to see is these big step changes in the public sector where they'll go for 10 years and won't raise the rates, and then there's a big rate and people get mad. And then they're hesitant to keep raising the rates. And so it's this, we call it the death spiral in infrastructure. I mean, that's what it really is. It's a death spiral. With the private side,
It is.
and so with water, the beauty of water for the public sector is that they can essentially, I hate to put it like this, but they can outsource that problem to someone else. But they can control those rates. And they'll say, look, we'll give you the ability to raise the rates every year, but it can only be by this much as opposed to this much in a big step change down the road. And so you actually get better pricing and rates make it, I mean, it's just going to depend on where you are, what you're paying now, and what it costs for the infrastructure. I can just tell you that nationally, water is underpriced. It's a huge issue nationally. Water systems are falling apart everywhere. We don't price water right. We don't price transportation right either. That's a whole other issue. I guess it's a complicated thing, but going private doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's just going to automatically charge you more. You can control that, or it may just cost less. It just depends on the content.
A couple more questions?
Let me go to the back for a second.
Some of your numbers.
Yes, sir.
On city revenues. Have you done any work on what kind of impact targeted incentives cities offer? What that does on revenues? What kind of, does that impact this?
Are you talking about like economic development?
A variety of things. We've got tax increment financing. We've got property tax abatement programs. Star bond. We have all sorts of incentive programs that tend to reduce the amount of revenue that comes into the Treasury. Have you factored those into any of your numbers that you talked about earlier?
No, I mean, I did not look at anything related to the economic development side. I will just confess to you and be very straightforward that I am not a fan of tax subsidies going to economic development. The academic literature on that is pretty compelling that says it doesn't really work, and I've seen it not work lots of places. So I'm a little bit skeptical of this idea of, and I don't mean that to like 100%. There may be some tax increment financing or something like that that could, in a limited situation, be appropriate to get. I mean, I do believe that that developers and new growth has an obligation to somehow pay for itself. If that's a way to do it, great. But just in terms of targeted incentives, I'm not a big fan. But that's not built into this. I was just looking at roads and transit.
There were two other hands up here.
Yeah, you, sir, and then I'll get to you.
Okay, back to privatization in Indiana.
Yes, sir.
Relying on the bankruptcy system to support privatization for public projects.
I'm sorry?
Using the bankruptcy system to support privatization of public projects. Is that okay?
I'm not quite following the question.
Well, that's what happened in Indiana. The guy went broke, and so somebody else took it over.
Well, actually, what happened is they're doing a financial restructuring. In the ultimate situation in which you got to a technical bankruptcy, as you're talking about, the state could revert the ownership of that road would revert back to the state. So, essentially, what happened there is people putting up money for infrastructure are willing to take a risk. That's the bottom line. And if they lose that on that investment, it's like you lose a bet. Sorry, the key in those situations is making sure that taxpayers don't get hit with that risk too. And they did that in Indiana, and they did it pretty well. I mean, there's nobody that's going to take a hit off of that. In fact, every infrastructure deal that I'm aware of like that has run through some kind of situation of financial problems. I mean, no, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't see the future. By transferring that risk to them, they're taking a hit, not you. I mean, you also have this. You have to kind of think about what happens if you don't do this. You taxpayers and the public sector tend to bear lots of risks of their own in infrastructure that never gets quantified. The public sector does a really bad job overall of sort of thinking about risk, and as a tendency, they tend to absorb a lot of it. So by being able to shift some of those risks, I mean, in Indiana, they kept the toll on that Indiana toll flat for 20 years. There was not enough, the road was falling apart. They didn't have enough money coming in to maintain that road. A private investor comes in, gives them a bucket of money, and puts in, I think it was on the order of $500 to $600 million of new pavement, new lanes, all of that. That's money that they would have never done in Indiana as a state running that operation. So risk goes both ways here. And if you structure a deal so that if somebody could go bankrupt, that's great. That's their problem. Make sure it's not your problem as a taxpayer. And that's incumbent upon the procurement officials and the policymakers ultimately to make sure that doesn't happen. Yes, sir.
Let me come back to the idea of privatization of transit.
Sir.
As I've traveled around this world, a lot of different cities have private taxis, vans, auto rickshaws, buses. We're stuck with big boxes right now here in Wichita. What is the key to breaking that mold and allowing private competition to come in, provide that service? Are there some regulations we need to reduce or take away? What is the key to getting this market opened up so the private sector can actually fill the void?
It's an onion that needs to be peeled back in numerous layers. There's federal funding, that's an issue. There's federal law, that's got issues. Local prohibitions on things like Wendell was talking about on prohibiting competition through jitneys and things like that. I think deregulating things like taxi services and all that. I think we should let the market flourish in lots of different ways. And so there is no simple answer to that question. That's going to be an incremental step of dealing with federal incentives and laws that have created the system we have today, and then kind of going through the dust bunnies that exist in local ordinances and charters.
Cities in America have already done that. How they implement it? Have they?
I'm not really aware. Outside of a limited thing like Wendell was talking about with Atlantic City having some jitneys.
Yeah, in San Francisco on Mission Street, but I think those are gone now.
Yeah, there's very limited.
Yeah, we had in LA about it was just before we approved the rail, the early 80s. We actually had a Mexican entrepreneur come in and put in I think about 100 or 150 jitneys. And then we had some changes in the law that basically forced him out of business. His enemies claimed he took the money to Mexico and stole from everyone, and the people that he used to serve that didn't have any service were really sorry that he was gone. And I should forgive me for going on. In Miami, there was a huge jitney movement, and jitneys were just the little vehicles, like these little they looked like an airport vehicle that would take you to the rental car operation. Miami had a huge jitney system that got in because of some quirks in the law, was carrying unbelievable numbers of people. The key to it was that you could always see a jitney coming, and so you knew it was coming. And there was a change in the law, wiped out all the ridership. This is in the early 80s. So around the country, for the most part, it is illegal to compete with transit.
Well, thank you very much,
Yes.
Len.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.